In 1977, a biomedical engineer living in the suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts, published a book that would quietly alter the course of American intelligence research. His name was Itzhak Bentov. He was not famous. He was not on television. He held no prestigious university chair, but he was something that mattered far more to the people who would eventually come looking for him. He was a genuine inventor, a man who had designed and patented the steerable cardiac catheter, a device so essential to modern heart surgery that virtually every cardiologist in America was using some version of his technology. He held multiple patents. He had spent years working at the intersection of physics, biology, and engineering, and he had recently turned the full force of his analytical mind toward a subject that no serious scientist in America was supposed to touch. He had begun to study the mechanics of human consciousness. The book was called Stalking the Wild Pendulum. In its pages, Bentov laid out a model of the universe that read like nothing any engineer had ever written. He proposed that all matter, every atom, every molecule, every cell in the human body, is composed of oscillating energy fields, vibrating at specific frequencies. He proposed that the human brain, when brought into a particular state of deep resonance, could synchronize with the electromagnetic field of the Earth itself, vibrating at approximately 7 to 7.5 cycles per second. And he proposed something that went further than any mainstream physicist had dared to go in print. He proposed that consciousness is not a byproduct of brain activity. Consciousness, Bentov argued, is a fundamental property of energy itself. It does not originate in the brain. It is not confined by the body, and it does not end when the body dies. 2 years after that book was published, Itzhak Bentov boarded American Airlines Flight 191 at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. He was heading to California and then onward to Japan, where he had been invited to speak with scientists about the relationship between physics and consciousness. The date was May 25, 1979. Seconds after takeoff, the left engine of the McDonnell Douglas DC-10 separated from the wing. The aircraft rolled, inverted, and crashed into an open field just beyond the runway. All 273 people on board were killed. It was, at the time, the deadliest aviation disaster in American history that was not caused by an act of terrorism. Itzhak Bentov was 55 years old. His death removed from the world a mind that had built one of the most sophisticated models of consciousness ever constructed by a working scientist. But it did not remove his work. 4 years after the crash, in 1983, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army Intelligence and Security Command sat down at Fort George G. Meade in Maryland and wrote a classified report titled Analysis and Assessment of the Gateway Process. The report was 29 pages long. It was commissioned by the Army. It was supported by the Central Intelligence Agency, and its theoretical foundation was built almost entirely on the work of Itzhak Bentov. The man was dead, but his ideas had been absorbed into the classified infrastructure of the United States government. The Pentagon had taken what Bentov discovered and locked it behind a wall of national security classification. That report, authored by Lieutenant Colonel Wayne M. McDonnell, did not merely cite Bentov's work in passing. It adopted Bentov's model wholesale. It used his equations. It used his diagrams. It used his description of how the human heart, when brought into a state of deep relaxation, produces a rhythmic sine wave pattern that resonates at approximately 7 cycles per second, the same frequency as the Earth's ionospheric cavity. It used his explanation of how that resonance travels through the fluid-filled ventricles of the brain and stimulates electromagnetic pulses that drive brainwave output to higher and higher levels of amplitude and frequency. And it used his most provocative conclusion, the one that no government agency had ever been willing to put into an official document before. The conclusion that consciousness, when sufficiently focused and accelerated, can exit the dimension of space and time entirely. McDonnell did not treat this as speculation. He treated it as operational intelligence. He was not writing a philosophy paper. He was writing a field assessment for his commanding officer, evaluating whether the Gateway experience, a consciousness training system developed by Robert Monroe at the Monroe Institute in Faber, Virginia, could produce operationally useful results for United States Army intelligence personnel. His conclusion was that it could. His further conclusion, documented in precise technical language across nearly 30 pages of classified text, was that the process worked because consciousness is a form of energy that obeys the laws of physics. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. Therefore, consciousness cannot be destroyed. Not by trauma, not by illness, not by the cessation of brain function, not by death. The report was classified. It was placed in a secure vault, and there it remained for 20 years until the CIA declassified it in 2003 through its Freedom of Information Act reading room. Even then, page 25, which reportedly contained the most sensitive conclusions about the nature of consciousness, beyond the physical body, was missing from the declassified version. That page was not recovered until 2021, nearly 4 decades after the report was written. But the Gateway Report was not the only place where scientists, with connections to the American aerospace and defense establishment, were reaching these conclusions. The story stretches far wider and runs far deeper than a single classified document. Consider the case of Edgar Mitchell. In February of 1971, Mitchell flew aboard Apollo 14 as the lunar module pilot and became the 6th human being to walk on the surface of the moon. He spent 9 hours working in the Frau Mauro Highlands, collecting rock samples and deploying scientific instruments on the lunar surface. He was a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a doctorate in aeronautics and astronautics. He was the very definition of a hard-nosed American scientist, trained by the best institutions in the country and tested in the most demanding environment in the universe. But something happened to Edgar Mitchell on the way home from the moon. As the Apollo 14 command module rotated slowly during its return to Earth, Mitchell looked out the window at the stars, the Earth, and the blackness of space. And he was struck by what he would later describe as an overwhelming sensation of interconnectedness, a visceral understanding that the molecules in his body, the molecules in the spacecraft, and the molecules in every star he could see had all been manufactured in the furnaces of ancient supernovae. He was, in the most literal physical sense, made of the same material as the universe he was looking at. And in that moment, he experienced what he would call an ecstasy of unity. A feeling that consciousness was not something that his brain was producing in isolation, but something that was woven into the fabric of the cosmos itself. When Mitchell returned to Earth, he did not simply file his experience away as an interesting personal anecdote. He resigned from NASA. Within 1 year, in 1972, he founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma, California. The word noetic comes from the Greek nous, meaning mind or inner knowing. The Institute's mission was to support rigorous scientific research into the nature of consciousness, including phenomena that mainstream science had traditionally dismissed. Phenomena like telepathy, remote perception, and the survival of consciousness beyond physical death. Mitchell spent the next 4 decades funding and supporting research that probed the boundaries of what consciousness could do. He joined the board of Robert Monroe's Institute. He collaborated with physicists, neurologists, and psychologists, and he spoke publicly, repeatedly, and without apology about his conviction that consciousness is not confined to the brain and does not end with the death of the body. He did this as a decorated naval officer, a combat veteran, a NASA astronaut, and a man who had walked on the moon. His credentials were beyond question. His conclusions were, to the mainstream scientific establishment, deeply unsettling. Then there was Thomas Campbell. Campbell is a physicist who received his Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees in physics and went on to build a career working in technology development, complex systems analysis, and applied physics for both the United States government and private industry. His work included projects for NASA and the Department of Defense. He is not a mystic. He is not a spiritual guru. He is a physicist whose career was built on the same rigorous, evidence-based methodology that governs all legitimate scientific work in America. In the early 1970s, while still a graduate student, Campbell encountered Robert Monroe and began participating in the earliest experiments at what would eventually become the Monroe Institute. Campbell was one of the original researchers who helped Monroe set up his laboratory for the study of consciousness, testing the hemisync audio technology that used binaural beat frequencies to synchronize the left and right hemispheres of the brain. Campbell participated in these experiments for years. He had out-of-body experiences. He documented them. He analyzed them with the same detachment and precision he applied to his government physics work. Over the following decades, Campbell developed what he calls "my big theory of everything," a comprehensive model of reality based on the proposition that consciousness, not matter, is the fundamental substrate of existence. In this model, the physical universe that we perceive through our senses is not the base reality. It is a computed experience, something generated by and within a larger consciousness system. Matter does not produce consciousness. Consciousness produces the experience of matter. This is not the raving of a man who has lost contact with reality. This is the published, documented position of a working physicist with decades of experience in classified and unclassified government research. Campbell has spoken at universities. He has published papers. He has presented his model to audiences of scientists and engineers, and his model aligns, in its fundamental premises, with the theoretical framework laid out in the classified Gateway Report, a report that was itself built on the work of Itzhak Bentov. The convergence of these threads is remarkable. A biomedical engineer who invented life-saving medical devices writes a revolutionary model of consciousness and is killed in an aviation disaster. His work is adopted by the Pentagon and classified. A NASA astronaut walks on the moon, has a transformative experience of cosmic consciousness, resigns from the space agency, and spends the rest of his life funding research into the survival of consciousness after death. A NASA physicist participates in the earliest consciousness experiments at the Monroe Institute, spends decades in government defense work, and then publishes A Theory of Everything, in which consciousness is the fundamental reality. These are not peripheral figures. These are men who worked inside the most powerful scientific and military institutions that the United States of America has ever built. They held security clearances. They launched rockets. They designed weapon systems. They analyzed intelligence. And every single one of them arrived at the same conclusion. Consciousness is not a product of the brain. It is something far more fundamental, far more enduring, and far more powerful than any materialist model of the universe has ever allowed. And the modern science is catching up. In 2023, Dr. Sam Parnia at New York University's Langone Medical Center published the results of the AWARE-2 study, the largest scientific investigation ever conducted into human consciousness during cardiac arrest. The study tracked 567 patients across multiple hospitals. Of those who survived and could be interviewed, nearly 40% reported vivid, lucid experiences of consciousness during the period when their hearts had stopped, and their brains showed no measurable electrical activity. These patients described events happening in the room during their resuscitation, conversations between medical staff, and visual details that they could not have perceived through any normal sensory mechanism. In that same year, researchers at the University of Michigan published a study that detected explosive surges of organized gamma wave activity in the brains of patients who had been declared clinically dead. Gamma waves are the brainwave signature most closely associated with heightened consciousness, intense focus, and lucid thought. These surges appeared in the temporoparieto-occipital junction, the precise region of the brain associated with consciousness, dreaming, and out-of-body experiences. The activity was not random noise. It was organized. It was coherent, and it occurred after death. In early 2026, the picture became even more dramatic. A comprehensive review study published in February revealed that across multiple cardiac arrest studies, approximately 20% of survivors recalled conscious experiences during periods when their brains showed no cortical activity whatsoever. The study further reported evidence that the brain may retain some form of functional activity for minutes to hours after clinical death is declared. Dr. Parnia stated publicly that the traditional understanding of death as a single, instantaneous event is fundamentally incorrect. Death is a process, and during that process, consciousness appears to persist. Now consider the timeline. In 1977, Itzhak Bentov published a model declaring that consciousness is energy, and energy is indestructible. In 1983, the United States Army took that model, tested it, and classified the results. In 1972, Edgar Mitchell founded an institute to study the survival of consciousness after death. In the early 1970s, Thomas Campbell began conducting consciousness experiments at the Monroe Institute, while simultaneously working as a physicist for NASA and the Department of Defense. For 50 years, this work accumulated in the background, in classified files, in private research institutes, in the personal experiences of astronauts and physicists, who had seen something that their training told them should be impossible. And then, in 2023, the most rigorous medical research in the world began producing empirical evidence for exactly what these men had been saying all along. The gamma waves, the lucid experiences during cardiac arrest, the 20% of survivors who remember being conscious when every instrument said they were dead. The data is not anecdotal. It is not subjective. It is measured, recorded, peer-reviewed, and published in the most respected scientific journals on the planet. The question is no longer whether consciousness survives death. The data is already pointing in that direction. The question is why the United States government classified this information in the first place, and what else remains locked in vaults that the public has never seen. Wernher von Braun, the German-born aerospace engineer who built the Saturn V rocket that carried American astronauts to the moon, wrote something before his death in 1977 that few people ever discuss. He wrote that everything science had taught him strengthened his belief in the continuity of spiritual existence after death. He wrote that he believed in an immortal soul. He wrote that science and faith were not contradictory, but complementary, and that the more he learned about the mechanics of the universe, the more certain he became that the end of the physical body is not the end of the conscious self. This was the man who made the Apollo program possible, the man who gave America the ability to reach the moon, and his private conviction, held alongside his public identity as the greatest rocket scientist of his generation, was that death is not final. The pattern is unmistakable. The closer these scientists got to the fundamental mechanics of the universe, whether through engineering, physics, space travel, or classified military research, the more consistently they arrived at the same conclusion. The physical body is temporary. Consciousness is not. The United States of America did not stumble upon this conclusion. It pursued it deliberately, with funding, with personnel, with classified programs, and with some of the finest scientific minds in its history. From Bentov's equations to Mitchell's Institute, to Campbell's theory, to the Gateway Report locked in a vault at Fort Meade, the trajectory is clear. America's scientists looked into the deepest nature of reality and found something that the institutions they served were not ready to make public. But the science has now escaped the vaults. The AWARE studies at NYU, the gamma wave research at Michigan, the 2026 review confirming consciousness during clinical death, the Neptune model proposed by a multinational team of neuroscientists, and the rebuttal from the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, arguing that the evidence cannot be explained by brain chemistry alone. The debate is no longer happening in secret. It is happening in the open, and it is happening in America. No other nation has produced this depth and breadth of consciousness research. No other nation has funded classified military programs to explore the operational potential of non-physical awareness. No other nation has sent an astronaut to the moon who then came home and dedicated his life to proving that consciousness transcends the body. This is an American story, built by American scientists, funded by American institutions, and now being validated by American research universities. The implications are immense. If consciousness is indeed a form of energy that persists beyond physical death, then every assumption we hold about the nature of human existence, about what it means to be alive, about what happens when we die, must be fundamentally reconsidered. This is not a comfortable thought. It is not a simple thought, but it is a thought that the evidence increasingly demands. Itzhak Bentov knew it. He died before the world was ready to listen. Edgar Mitchell knew it. He spent 40 years trying to build the scientific foundation to prove it. Thomas Campbell knew it. He constructed an entire theory of everything around it. The United States Army knew it in 1983, when it classified the Gateway Report. And now, in the third decade of the 21st century, the peer-reviewed medical literature is confirming it. You are not merely a body. The consciousness reading these words, the awareness that makes you who you are, is not something that your brain is generating like heat from an engine. It is something far more fundamental than that. And when the engine stops, when the body fails, when the instruments go silent, that consciousness does not disappear. It transitions. That is not faith. That is not philosophy. That is what the classified files say. That is what the astronauts experienced. That is what the physicists calculated. And that is what the medical data now shows. The science was born in America. It was classified in America. And it is being proven in America. The rest of the world is only now beginning to catch up.